In 1364, the city of Pisa paid a mercenary company 130,000 gold florins, not to fight for them, to leave. To simply pack up, ride on, and become someone else's disaster. Pisa wasn't even at war. That number is the price of making an army stop existing, and it is the one bill nobody in medieval Europe ever learned how to pay. We tell the story of medieval war as if the army belonged to the king. He points at a map, and men appear. He points at a city, and it falls. The banners are his. The knights are his. The whole glittering machine answers to one will. Because he is the king, and this is his army. That picture is a lie of ownership. It hides the single hardest problem any medieval ruler ever faced, harder than winning battles, harder than taking castles. Not how to command an army, how to afford one. And then, when the fighting was finally over, how to make it go away. Because here is the thing the chronicles rarely say out loud. A medieval army was a mouth that never closed, and the king was not its owner. He was, at best, the man currently holding the bill. Start with the reframe. You cannot own a medieval army. Not really. The word own implies a thing that sits still when you're done with it, a sword you hang on the wall, a castle that waits. An army is not that. An army is thousands of men who need to eat today, and tomorrow, and the day after, whether or not there is a battle. It is horses that need fodder, wagons that need repair, wages that fall due on a schedule that does not care about your treasury. So the honest verb isn't own, it's rent. A medieval army was never a possession. It was a subscription, and the payment came due whether you used it or not. That single fact reorganizes everything. It means the central question of medieval defense was never really military. It was financial. Every ruler faced the same constraint, and the constraint was brutally simple. Soldiers are a recurring cost, and that cost does not switch off. A mouth that never closes. There were, across medieval Europe, essentially 3 ways to feed that mouth. 3 models for renting an army. And this is the part worth staying, for each of the 3 carried a defect wired into its design. Not bad luck. Not bad kings. A structural flaw you could see coming, baked into the arrangement itself. The first model was cheap and barely worked. The second worked beautifully and nearly bankrupted everyone who used it. And the third, the clever one, the one that felt like a solution, quietly set up the most dangerous problem of all. A problem that didn't detonate on the battlefield. It detonated the day the war ended. Let's feed the mouth. Before any of the 3 models make sense, you have to feel the weight of the thing they're all trying to solve. So stand in a medieval camp for a moment. It is morning. Nothing is happening. There is no battle today, maybe no battle this week. And already the army is expensive. Several thousand men have woken up hungry. Each of them will eat something like 2 to 3 pounds of bread, or its equivalent, every single day. And that grain has to come from somewhere bought, requisitioned, or stolen, but never free. The horses eat more than the men. A war horse can go through 10 pounds of grain a day on top of forage, and an army of any size drags thousands of horses behind it. Before a single arrow is loosed, the camp has already consumed a small town's worth of food. Now add the wages, because most of these men are not there for glory. They are there to be paid, and the pay ran on a strict ladder. In English service during the long wars with France, a knight drew 2 shillings a day, 24 pence. A man-at-arms or esquire, 12. A mounted archer, 6. A common foot archer, 3 pence a day. A spearman, 2. Hold those numbers against the wider world for a second. A skilled craftsman, a mason, a carpenter, a man at the top of his civilian trade earned about 4 pence a day. A single knight cost the crown the wages of 6 skilled craftsmen every day. Whether he fought or not, multiply that out. A modest field army of a few thousand men, with its knights and its archers and its baggage train, burned through money at a rate that could swallow a kingdom's entire ordinary income in a single campaigning season. Not because anyone was corrupt, because that is simply what the arithmetic came to when you paid thousands of men, daily, to stand in a field. And here is the cruel twist folded into that arithmetic. The machine leaked even as you paid it. An army with no battle to fight still lost men every week to the sickness that swept through crowded, filthy camps faster than any enemy ever could, to desertion, to the simple pull of home when the harvest came due. Across the medieval centuries, disease killed far more soldiers than swords did. So the ruler sat in the worst position any buyer can occupy. He was paying full price, every single day, for a force that was quietly shrinking in front of him, funding readiness and watching it evaporate in the same breath. This is the mechanism sitting under everything that follows, so let's name it plainly. A medieval army was a machine that converted coin into readiness at a fixed daily rate. And the machine had no off switch. You could not pause it. You could not fold it up and put it in a drawer. From the moment you gathered it, it was eating, and an army eats, whether or not it fights. That is the constraint. Everything a medieval ruler ever did about war was, underneath, an attempt to manage that one unforgiving line item, the daily burn of men who had to be fed and paid on a clock that never stopped ticking. So how do you get an army without going broke? For most of the Middle Ages, the first answer wasn't to pay at all. It was to make someone else owe you the men. The oldest solution was also the cleverest piece of accounting in the medieval world, because it made the daily burn technically disappear. Its name, in the dry Latin of the clerks, was servitium debitum, the service owed. The idea was elegant. Instead of paying soldiers, the crown gave out land. A great lord received an estate. In return, he owed the king a fixed number of knights. He, in turn, parceled his own land out to lesser men who owed him their service in the saddle. Land flowed downward. Military obligation flowed upward. On paper, the king now had an army that cost him nothing at all. No wages, no daily burn. The men fed themselves off the fields they had been granted, and turned up when summoned, because that was the rent they paid for the ground under their feet. Feel how attractive that is. The single most expensive thing in medieval life, the standing daily cost of armed men, has been made to vanish into the land itself. The soldier is now his own paymaster. But look at what the crown gave up to get it, because the defect is right there in the fine print. The service owed was not unlimited. In England, the custom settled at roughly 40 days a year. 40 days of unpaid campaigning, often only within the realm or its near borders, with each knight supplying his own food, his own horse, his own equipment. After that, the obligation was met. The men were, by right and by custom, free to go home. 40 days. Sit with how short that is. It is barely enough to gather an army, march it to a frontier, and look at the enemy, let alone besiege a serious castle, which could grind on for months. On roughly day 39 of a campaign that is finally going well, a medieval king could stand and watch a meaningful part of his army begin, entirely lawfully, to pack up and ride home. They didn't owe him day 41. That was the deal, and the deal was the whole point, and the clock was only the first flaw. An army raised this way was gloriously uneven. The men came from 100 different estates, trained to 100 different standards, armed to whatever level each landholder could afford or could be bothered to reach. Some arrived as superb heavy cavalry. Others arrived as a tired man on a tired horse with a rusted mail shirt, technically fulfilling an obligation and not 1 ounce more. There was no drill, no common standard, no shared discipline, just a coalition of individual bargains that happened to gather on the same field. We should be honest here, because the tidy textbook version of this, the neat pyramid of king and lord and knight, feudalism drawn as a clean diagram, is one that historians now treat with real suspicion. The reality on the ground was messier, more negotiated, more local than any diagram admits, and it varied enormously from England to France to the German lands and across whole centuries. But strip away the argument over the word, and the mechanism underneath is not in doubt. Land bought service, service was capped, and a capped army is a blunt instrument. So this is Model 1. Its genius is that it makes the daily burn disappear. Its defect is that you get a short-term, uneven, geographically limited army that can lawfully evaporate at the worst possible moment, right when a long war needs it most. It is cheap precisely because it is weak, which raises an obvious question. What if you didn't want cheap and weak? What if you were willing to pay for men who would go anywhere, stay as long as you liked, and actually knew what they were doing? There was a market for exactly those men. And by the 14th century, in the richest corner of Europe, that market had grown into something no ruler had ever seen before. A fully professional industry of violence. Picture the opposite of the reluctant. Home by day 40 night. Picture a soldier who has no land to return to and no lord to obey, only a contract. He will march to any country you name. He will stay in the field as long as your money lasts, through winter, past 40 days, past 400. He is trained, because fighting is not his duty, it is his trade, and a man's trade is the thing he is good at. He is, in every sense that matters to a paymaster, better than the levy. He is also, in one specific sense, far more dangerous. He is loyal to the coin, not to the crown. Nowhere did this market grow more sophisticated than in 14th century Italy, where wealthy city-states with small populations had money to spend and no desire to die in person. They bought their wars. And to sell wars back to them, The mercenary companies became astonishingly organized, less like war bands, more like firms. Consider the most famous of them, the company that an Englishman named John Hawkwood led across Italy in the second half of the 14th century. His white company did not run on a handshake and a prayer. It ran on paperwork. It kept chancellors, notaries, treasurers. It signed formal written contracts, the Italians called them, condotte, which is where the word condottiere comes from, that spelled out the number of men, the rate of pay, the length of service, the terms of renewal. This was the daily burn problem turned into an actual business model. Violence sold by contract, with an administrative back office to invoice for it. And the company was more than its fighters. It moved as a portable economy, its own merchants and moneylenders, its armorers and smiths, cooks, carters, and the crowd of dependents who lived off the wages. A large company on the march was effectively a walking city, one whose entire tax base was the next contract. Hold on to that image, because a city cannot simply be dismissed. When the contract ended, the fighters did not evaporate, and neither did the small economy that fed on them, and it delivered. A professional company would go where the levy could not, and stay when the levy would not. For a ruler with a full treasury and a hard war, this was the answer to everything the feudal levy got wrong. But now feel the defect on this side, because it is just as structural as the 40-day clock, only it fails in the opposite direction. The levy's flaw was that it ended too soon. The mercenary's flaw was that it never truly ended, and it was loyal to nobody. The same professionalism that made these men reliable in the field made them purely transactional out of it. They served the payment, and only the payment. Let the money stop, let a campaign wind down, let a treasury run dry, and the contract that had aimed all that skill at your enemy simply lapsed. What you were left with was several thousand trained, organized, landless fighting men inside your country, no longer being paid by you, and no longer pointed at anyone in particular. We'll come back to what that means, because it is the whole hidden heart of this story. For now, just hold the shape of the trade-off. Model 2. The mercenary company solved every problem Model 1 had. It gave you range, endurance, skill, and a signature on a contract. It cost a fortune, and it bought you the loyalty of a business, not a subject. So the ruler is now trapped between two bad options. A cheap army that's weak and vanishes in 40 days, or an excellent army that's ruinously expensive and loyal, only to its own wages. Stated like that, the next move almost suggests itself. What if you could take the cheapness of the first and the professionalism of the second, and bridge them with a single clever financial instrument? The bridge already existed, and it was made of money. Its logic is simple enough to feel obvious once you see it. If the problem with the feudal levy is that it hands you soldiers you can't use for long, then stop asking for soldiers. Ask for cash instead. Then use the cash to hire the professionals who will actually stay. In England, it even had a name, scutage, from the Latin word for shield. Shield money. A landholder who owed the king knights could, instead of showing up, simply pay a sum for each knight's fee and stay home. Under Henry II, in the 12th century, the rate ran at about 2 marks per fee, roughly 26 shillings and 8 pence, and the king reached for it again and again across his reign, including to fund a campaign toward Toulouse. By the time of his son John, the demand climbed higher and came more often, 2.5 marks, then 3, levied year after year, until the barons' fury over it helped drive them into revolt. Look at what has quietly happened. The obligation to serve has been turned into a payment. Military duty has become a line of tax revenue. And once the king is holding coins instead of commanding knights, he can do the thing coins are best at. He can spend them on whoever he likes, for as long as the money holds. He can hire the professionals. The cap is gone. The unevenness is gone. Defense has been converted, cleanly and completely, into budget. This is the model that built the great war machines of the later Middle Ages. Think of the English crown in its long 14th century war with France. This was no longer a 40-day levy. It was a financial operation on a national scale. At its height, the war could swallow something on the order of 50 to 100,000 pounds a year, and in the very hardest years, the crown's total war spending ran higher still sums that dwarfed the ordinary income of the kingdom. To feed it, the crown reached for extraordinary money. Heavy taxes on the wool trade, schemes to corner the wool market outright for hundreds of thousands of pounds, and above all, loans. Vast loans from the great banking houses of Italy. And when the debts finally could not be paid, the shock ran backward down the credit chain and helped break some of the richest banks in Europe, the Bardi and the Peruzzi of Florence among them. A king's war had become a machine that could bankrupt bankers 1,000 miles away. But notice the counterfactual, the thing this clever solution quietly made impossible. Under the old land for service bargain, the man who fought for you was bound to you by something other than money. He held his ground from you. His family's standing was tied to yours. The relationship was personal and, in its way, permanent. Convert all of that into wages, and you gain a professional army, but you lose the bond. The men in the field now serve the paymaster, whoever the paymaster happens to be. Loyalty has become a subscription too. And a subscription can be outbid or simply canceled the moment the funds run dry. So here is the ladder the three models climb. The levy made the daily burn vanish and handed you a weak, short army in return. The mercenary gave you a superb army and charged you a fortune for men loyal to their own wages. And commutation, turning service into cash, bought you a real war machine at the cost of turning your entire defense into a budget and your soldiers into contractors. Every model, a defect. And so far, every defect has shown up while the war is on, but we have not yet touched the worst one. Because none of these three men, the levied knight, the hired professional, the cash-funded contractor, has told you what happens on the day the war ends. That is the day the whole system breaks. Go back to the picture we started with. The king points, and the army appears. His will summons it out of the land and the treasury, men and horses and banners, conjured by command. Now watch that same picture run in reverse, because this is the move the popular story never makes. The war is over. The treaty is signed. The king no longer needs the army and no longer wants to pay for it, so he gives the obvious order. He points and commands the army to disappear, and nothing disappears. That is the flip at the center of everything. A medieval ruler could raise an army. He could not switch one off. Summoning was a command. Disbanding was only a wish. Because disband doesn't dissolve anything, it just stops the pay. And when you stop paying several thousand trained, organized, landless men, you have not made them vanish. You have only changed what they are. Yesterday, they were your army. Today, they are several thousand trained, organized, landless men, still armed, still together, still led by the same captains, and no longer receiving the one wage that pointed them at your enemy instead of at you. Remember the mouth that never closes. An army eats whether or not it fights. Stop feeding it, and it does not politely starve. It feeds itself on whoever is nearest. Europe learned this at frightening scale in the 14th century. When the great truce between England and France was sealed in 1360, the fighting stopped, but the fighters did not go home, because for tens of thousands of them there was no home to go to and no other trade to return to. So they pooled. Out of the wreckage of the paused war rose what the French came to call the Great Companies, the routiers, masterless soldiers, by some chronicle counts many thousands strong, though medieval numbers always deserve a raised eyebrow, and the true figures were almost certainly lower than the terrified towns reported. Exact count aside, the thing itself was real, and it was loose in the countryside. And they solved their own budget problem, the only way an unpaid army can. They turned the machine on the very population it had recently been defending. They seized towns and demanded money to leave them unburned, a systematic protection racket the French knew by a plain, chilling word, potus. The army had simply found a new employer. The victims were now the payroll. Here is where honesty matters, because it would be too neat to say the constraint alone produced this. It didn't dictate the outcome, it enabled it. Some captains took honest service elsewhere. Some men really did drift back to farms. Not every disbanded soldier became a brigand. The constraint set the trap. Human choices decided who fell into it. But the trap was always there. It was structural. And no ruler had ever budgeted a single coin for the moment it sprang. And how badly could it spring? In 1362, near a town called Brignays in the south of France, the crown finally sent a royal army to crush these unemployed companies for good. It went wrong in the most humiliating way imaginable. The routiers, the discarded, the unpaid, the men the state had tried to switch off, outmaneuvered the king's own force and destroyed it. The Constable of France, one of the great officers of the realm, was mortally wounded on that field. His son was killed beside him. Men the crown had stopped paying had just beaten the crown in open battle. Read that again as an accounting fact, because that is exactly what it is. The state had tried to close out a line item to stop the daily burn, now that the war was done, and the line item had picked up its weapons and won. The king could conjure an army out of nothing. He could not send it back to nothing. And the gap between those two powers, easy to raise, impossible to dismiss, is the wound the whole medieval system of war quietly bled out through. So what do? If you cannot disband an army, cannot afford to keep it, and cannot even beat it in the field. You arrive, by sheer exhaustion, at the answer this whole story has been circling. If the army will not stop existing, you pay to make it exist somewhere else. That is the real solution medieval rulers backed into. Not disbandment redirection. You bribe the problem over the horizon. Watch France do exactly this. Unable to destroy the companies infesting its own countryside, the crown in 1366 handed them to a soldier named Bertrand du Guesclin and pointed him at Spain, where a civil war in Castile conveniently needed fighting men. The logic was nakedly financial. The companies were a cost. France could neither pay nor cancel, so France exported the cost. Let them ravage someone else's kingdom instead. Let Castile's war absorb the men that France's peace could not. Historians still argue over how coordinated this really was, how much of it was grand policy, and how much lucky improvisation. But the shape of the thing is unmistakable. A state paying, in effect, to relocate its own disbanded army. And relocation did not come cheap either. Du Guesclin himself, captured later in the Spanish fighting, was ransomed for a sum reported at 100,000 gold coins, a figure that tells you how thoroughly the whole grim market had inflated, when even buying back the man you sent to remove the problem cost a small fortune. Nor was any of it a permanent fix. The companies were exported, and fresh ones formed behind them. They were bought off and drifted back for more. Paying an army to be elsewhere never actually ended the problem. It rented a pause, and the pause, like everything else in this story, came with a price and an expiry date. And now the number we opened with finally lands in its proper place. When the city of Pisa handed John Hawkwood's company 130,000 gold florins in 1364, this is the transaction they were making. Not payment for services. Payment for absence. Pisa wasn't buying a war. It was buying the end of one. It had never started buying the simple fact of these men being elsewhere. And Hawkwood, the consummate professional, understood his own product perfectly. Sometimes the thing a company sells isn't its sword. It's its willingness to point that sword away from you, for a price. Feel how strange this is as a line in a ledger. Cities and kingdoms across the 14th century paid enormous sums larger than many an actual war budget. Not to win, not to defend, not to conquer. To be left alone. To purchase the departure of armies that no longer had any war to fight and no way to switch themselves off. The most expensive thing in medieval warfare, it turns out, was not the battle. It was the peace on the far side of it, the long, unbudgeted bill for men who had learned that being paid to leave was just another way of being paid. That is the cost the chronicles tally last, if they tally it at all, and it is the cost that no king, standing at the start of a war and counting what it would take to win, ever thought to write down. Reach for the modern word for what we've been describing, and you land on something oddly bloodless. A decommissioning cost. The price not of running a thing, but of shutting it down. We are still terrible at it, in almost exactly the medieval way. When a country plans a war, it budgets the fighting, not the long aftermath of demobilizing the soldiers. When a company builds a power plant, the cost of one day safely closing it down is the line that gets waved away. When a business hires for a boom, it rarely budgets for the boom's end. We are fluent in the cost of starting things. We stay strangely illiterate in the cost of stopping them. Across 7 centuries, the blind spot has barely moved. You plan the operating cost, and you forget the liquidation cost. But an honest analogy has to name where it breaks. So here is the seam. A modern institution, for all its failures, usually can switch its people off. It ends the contracts, closes the plant, disperses the workforce, and the laid-off employees go home. They may be furious. They are not an army. That is the exact asymmetry the medieval ruler never had. His disbanded workforce kept its weapons, kept its organization, kept its captains, and had nowhere to disperse to. He couldn't simply absorb the shutdown cost, because his shutdown cost could saddle up and burn a town. So the medieval version isn't merely they forgot to budget for the ending. It's something sharper and worth carrying out of all this. They built a thing that was far easier to start than to stop, and then discovered, too late, that the unpaid ending had a will of its own. So strip the banners off the story, and here is what a medieval army actually was. Not a possession. Not a thing a king owned and set down when he was finished with it. A recurring cost with a mind of its own, a mouth that never closed, that ate in war and ate in peace, and that could not be commanded out of existence the way it had been commanded into it. 3 ways to feed it, and every one of them flawed by design. The levy, cheap and gone in 40 days. The mercenary, magnificent and loyal to nothing but the coin. The cash-funded contract, a true war machine bought at the price of turning loyalty itself into a subscription. And underneath all three, the cost no model priced and no king escaped. The bill that came due when the war was won and the army was still there. Raising an army was the problem every ruler expected. Getting rid of one was the problem that got them. The mouth never closes, and paying it to fight, it turns out, was never the hard part. Paying for an army is difficult. Paying for it to stop existing is harder. Which leaves one last question hanging, and it's the one we'll follow next. If you couldn't disband an army, and couldn't afford to keep it standing forever, what happened to the rulers who tried to make the army permanent anyway, who simply never let the war end? That's where this money story turns genuinely strange. But that is the next ledger to open.